Hi, and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm here this morning with Sam Hallam, who has over 10 years of experience of working with children and young people. Sam, if you'd like to tell us a bit more about your experience.
Yeah, so like I say, over 10 years, I've worked in private nurseries, I've worked in schools, but my sort of passion is tackling those issues around children and young people. So I've worked for a DA charity, I've worked for drug and alcohol, and now I'm in mental health. So quite all over the place.
And this is what I love is when I talk to professionals, more often than not, it's never just one aspect. It's I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. It's like many, many hats.
Yes.
And would you say there's a particular sort of age group you like working with more so than others?
I think controversially, I like teenagers.
Yeah.
Teenagers do tend to scare a lot of people, but I think you get a lot more, and I think it comes from a personal background as well. So for myself, I was a teenager who struggled with depression and anxiety, and obviously back then schools were shocking in terms of mental health and things like that. So I think it does come from a personal place of like wanting to be heard and you know, making sure that young person is heard and in their way as well, because not everybody's the same.
No, that's so true. And I think more often than not, when you are working with children, you've got to, there's a lot, especially, I suppose in a way it's similar to working with adult victims and survivors of domestic abuses. You have to give them the control, don't you? Because they've been so not used to having any control over their life, that giving them that choice as to what they disclose and what they don't disclose. And it can be, especially with children, from one week to the next, the mood changes. They could have had a good week, they could have had a bad week. You just don't know, do you? You've got to give it to them to open up.
Yeah, and there's different ways you can do it as well, and I think that's what young people really respond to, is rather than you going in with a notepad and pen and a tick box activity, if you go in and you ask them to explain how they're feeling through a Spotify playlist or, you know, through a game or something like that, it really opens up that dynamic for you to build a positive relationship with them, and then they're in turn more likely to open up to you, disclose if they need to, and you know, build on that relationship together. So yeah,
and that must be so rewarding, because over time, and I only work very briefly doing that, but when you do see them open up and you do see them have that comment, and it could be something like one sentence that they've said, it doesn't, you know, I think some people have this idea that it's like in a movie, isn't it? They start blurting everything out, and it's like, it doesn't work that way. It might just be a very small thing that they've said that's such a positive, you know, for that week, that they've said, and they think, oh God, I feel like we're getting somewhere now. It is those real sort of baby steps, because the impact that abuse has on children, and again, it's something I really would like to think I'd be passionate about for the future, is that education in schools. You know, it's secondary school, it's so important, but primary as well, where how many social media kind of apps and things that children are able to access these days at ages that they probably shouldn't do, all that kind of thing. And for them to be able to think, actually, I can have conversations and I am able to open up about how I feel. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because they've got so many influences out there and on them, that you've got to really think about how you approach that conversation, and it's that impact that will last a long time.
Yeah. And when you're working with children of domestic abuse, they're shrouded by how things should be, and a picture that's almost painted, whether it's by society, of what they should have, so white picket fence, nuclear family, that kind of thing. So they feel at a loss, so they're angry at that because they haven't got it. Or the picture that is being painted by the perpetrator at home, in terms of, we are a happy family, you know, you don't go to school and share this. What do you mean you spoke to that teacher today? What's going on? You know, so there's a torn element for young people as well, in terms of what do they say, what can they say, how can they act, and that's around, when you're looking at teenagers, that's around when they're learning themselves who they are.
Yeah,
you know, their phases, the moody haircuts, the music and everything. It's, you know, it's around when they're trying to establish themselves, and if they're getting nothing but what as adults we see as negative influences, they're going to just keep doing with that learned behavior and repeating the cycle.
You take abuse out of a teenager's life, and it's difficult enough being a teenager and going through emotions and hormones and everything else, but then put domestic abuse into that situation. And you're right, you know, I had somebody ask me the other day, and it was the most bizarre question I think I've ever been asked, was So how does a child become a perpetrator? You know, because perpetrators come from somewhere. How do they become? And you're like, well, it's not that simple.
No.
It's not that straightforward. And there's a lot of learned behavior. And this is why I think it is important in schools that there is that conversation around boundaries, you know, for both sides. If you are a potential victim in the future or a potential perpetrator, that there is that you are allowed to say no, you are allowed to have boundaries. You know, there's been this sort of societal shift from when, for example, I'm older than you, but when I was younger, where, you know, children were seen and not heard, you didn't have an opinion, you didn't speak, you did as you were told, or you feared the consequences of that. Whereas now we're trying to move to a time where it's a mutual respect thing between yourself and your child, but then that's got to have a balance. And it is like, you know, juggling 20 plates and going, how can I get this right? You know, and for parents who either watch or listen, you know, what sort of advice would you give to them if they haven't necessarily, you know, because again, this conversation I've had with lots of different professionals is many victims do not realize that they're in an abusive situation, and people think, well, that's absolutely bonkers. Well, it isn't, because if your normal is somebody behaving and treating you in a domestically abusive way, then that is your normal. You don't know any different. So it isn't the victim's fault, and there's none of that victim blaming, you know, from my side in the slightest. And I think it's very difficult sometimes when you are trying to talk to parents who, or I can imagine from your perspective, talking to parents whose children are being, you know, subjected to abuse or living in an abusive household, how that conversation goes.
Yeah, and I think the issue you've got when you're looking at it like that is you've got the sort of the internal complex that's going on for a parent, where they're having to admit, yes, I have been in an abusive relationship for years, couple of months, whatever. And yes, that has impacted my children. So you have that's kind of like one of the first barriers you hit when you're trying to persuade a parent or discuss with a parent about getting support for their child. But then also, if you've got a child who's perhaps emotional dysregulation, so they're quite angry at home, that, you know, or they're quick to anger, and then when you identify that to the parent, that okay, this could be because of what they've seen, that, you know, parents can tend to feel like they're being blamed, even though you're trying to avoid victim blaming, absolutely, but they can feel like they've completely failed as a parent in raising their child. And then, like you say, it doesn't stop when you leave if you have got children, because the perpetrator can still control and manipulate through the court system, through contact, etc. So it's like I always found it quite a sensitive area of like saying, right, your child needs support because this is what's happened. However, they might still need support in the future, because you don't want to put them off, because it's quite easy to just go, right, well, I'll just go back to what I know and back to the abuser and back to the way things were, because that's what the children know. And a few young people that I used to work with, they would kind of describe, a lot of the time they describe it as a loss of that parent, which it is, but to them, if that's all they've known is kind of that household to be tense, is that household to be loud if there's arguments and things like that, you take that away, they've got a hole, they've got a void of something in their normality that's gone. So how do they fill it? And most of the time with children, it's emotions. And that's the only way that they can communicate. If you think back to babies, the way they know something's wrong with a child is they cry.
Yes, gosh, yeah.
So, you know, that void needs filling, or they need space to understand why they've got that void, and how it's going to now look in terms of their family dynamic.
God, yeah. You know, there's so many things you've said that made me just go, and I thought I knew a bit. Let me just go back to the drawing board. It is, you know, this is why I am obviously fascinated and passionate about children and young people and the impact that it does have. And I think what you've just touched on there that I think is so important as well is there is no quick fix. You know, and you're not to feel like a failure if your child is re-referred, or if those are very difficult things, because I think for a lot of people, you know, again, a podcast did a while ago with Sam Fisher was talking about the people have this idea, well, you've left the situation now, there you go, done and dusted. Actually, any professional knows that that's when things escalate. That's when actually that's the dangerous time, because the perpetrator is losing those two things that they have over you, which is power and control, and also power and control over the children. So therefore, if they can't control you anymore because you've come through the fog and gone, actually, this is not how I want my life to pan out, they will then up the ante with the children. And then obviously that's even more difficult for the children because they're already dealing with all those things, like you've said, a parent that they're used to living with, that at the end of the day, I think this is a really hard concept for a lot of people to understand, but that child still loves that parent. And that is something that I've come across many, many times when people have said to me, how can they love, how could they love that person when they've done this? But that person's thinking from an adult perspective that isn't in that situation. They're looking in and judge. And again, it's the judgment, isn't it? There's so much judgment around domestic abuse, and you're judging a situation that you have actually got no understanding of on any kind of level, really, because at the end of the day, do you want your child then growing up hating that person? Are they then going to grow up being bitter and then have a whole other heap of complications and issues in the future? It's a very, very difficult line, I think, for a lot of parents to tread. And it's not straightforward and it's not easy by any means. But I think, it is important that people, it isn't a quick fix. There will be times when, many of us as adults think, I've needed counselling in my 20s or my 30s or my 40s. There's no shame in that, because there are things that are unresolved that you need to deal with. Well, why is it any different for a child or a teenager, young person, that is experienced domestic abuse and needs to work through those issues and those, obviously the concerns that they've had growing up? And, I think we don't know, do we, what children are thinking? Am I going to end up like that? One way or another? Am I going to end up being a victim? Am I going to end up being a perpetrator? If they then, have worked through some of the issues, it's just, I think for me, it's one of the biggest minefields.
Yeah, and you do get a real mix. No two children's reactions to having domestic abuse at home is the same. You get similarities, but everybody is different. You do get some children who, for the protective parent, it feels that they are siding with the abusive parent, because they might say, well, I love that parent, I want to go and live with that parent, and especially if it's meant that the protective parents had to move out and maybe they're in a refuge and it's not ideal in terms of living situations. So you do have obviously that side, and then you have the side of, sometimes more with teenagers, if they're starting to understand that the behaviour is unhealthy and that the boundaries have been crossed, but at the same time it is still their parent. So what I think we're all innately, I'm sure there'll be people who would disagree with me on it, but we're all innately going to love our parents. They are our main caregivers. From the minute we come out, blinking, they are the ones that give us our needs. So to break that just because of something, because a lot of children can sometimes dissociate because they'll see it as, that happened to mum or that happened to dad, didn't happen to me.
Right,
that's always been great with me. Mum's always took me out at whatever the situation is. So then they can feel dissociated, so they don't understand their parents' viewpoint. And then when you have the parents that don't understand the children's viewpoint, like you say, how can you love this person who's doing this? You do have then a home clash, which again adds another dynamic to it. So it's a way of kind of understanding it, and it's being aware of all those different elements as well that feed into it. And you've got obviously different key stages for the children themselves. We've just started a new term, so you've got children transitioning, you've got children going into year 11, big years, things like that. So they've got that minefield, as well as kind of the nuances of friendships and like I say before, finding themselves. So it's no two children's experiences are the same, and it's about being aware of that, and then, like you say, not trying to go in as a worker and fix that problem, because essentially all you're doing is putting a plaster on it that's eventually got to be ripped off, and it's going to hurt.
And it's going to hurt, exactly.
So it's all about teaching those coping strategies. So a lot of it obviously is therapeutic intervention, but giving them skills that are going to last, because if they've just left and they come into for support, you can't put a plaster on it, because like I say, it could get worse or escalate, etc. So you've got to give them coping skills that they can dip back into, which is sort of understandable why when children kind of, maybe you've seen them when they're in year 6, but then they get referred when they're in year 8. That is two different, complete different mindsets.
Of course, they've developed.
they might remember 1 or 2 coping strategies that you did with them in year 6 that have stuck, that they feel work, but then things have changed.
Yes.
So, you know, it's about kind of revisiting them and then changing them again, because they'll have changed as people.
They'll change as people, yeah. So you've got they've got the coping mechanisms have got to move with the child and the teenagers and the adult that they're going to become. Yeah, I tell you, just like that to you, because you know, every parent's, I would say, biggest fear, being a parent myself, is you just want your children to be happy.
Yeah.
That is your sole goal in life, is, you know, if they hurt, you hurt.
Yeah.
It is one of the most difficult things for a parent to think that your child is in any kind of pain, whether they've fallen over and bumped the knee, or whether there's something a lot deeper going on. Nobody wants their child to be in any kind of pain. And, you know, to think that they are, I think what I'm trying to say is the best thing for any parent to do, if they for any reason think that there are signs in their child that, you know, the mood is changing, or they've become quite reclusive and just want to stay more in the room, you know, you don't have to sort of go, well, I think you need this, or I think you need that, because, you know, as parents, we don't know what the answer is. That's what the professionals are for. But to have that, you know, I think a lot of parents don't appreciate as well, and if parents haven't been involved in terms of with support services, and they're thinking to themselves, but I do think there's something, my gut's telling me there's something wrong, then there is, isn't there? There's plenty of places you can go where you can look at referral, where, you know, and even if it's just a case of completing a referral form in your local area and saying, okay, actually, that's shocked me, because I didn't think this and this were elements of domestic abuse, and actually they are. So there's no harm in, and it's all confidential. I think it's a big thing people forget, isn't it? When it's a conversation like this,
and that, you know, that in itself is scary for parents, because you, like you say, you might identify that your child needs support, and you take that leap, especially like you say, if you've not had support services before, you take that leap, you do the referral, and then someone rings you and goes, oh yeah, by the way, essentially you're not going to know anything about what I'm talking to your child about. I'm going to see him away from you, you're not going to be there. And you know, it gets their back up, but it's a conversation then that you have with that parent, and because when you work with a child, you're not just working with that child, you're working with the systems around them. So the first and foremost is home. So, you know, you're working with that parent, and if you don't gel with that parent, or, you know, you don't get a professional click with that parent, you're not going to get through the door to see the child. No. So you've got to understand. So again, there's that understanding of, you know, what has that parent been through? And it might be that you ask them, you know, like, tell me yourself, you know, what's happened from your point of view. Or it might be that, you know, they've been through your service before, so you've got that information. But you want to show that parent that you care, so then they know that you care about their child. Yes. And you start going that way around. But yeah, it's a sensitive, shall we say, like, kind of a little field. But once you're in it, you don't just make a difference for that child. You do find that you end up making a difference for the whole family. Absolutely, because then you see that the child is able to, like you say, as we get older, we find we have different coping mechanisms, and we have different ways of dealing with things. And that will develop as you get older. And if parents are more aware of what those mechanisms are that are helping that child, then you stand a chance of your child having, you know, you can never say normal life, can you? I don't think any of us, anybody on the planet has a normal life. I think, you know, we're lucky that we're living and breathing, basically. But if children can have those coping mechanisms, and all you want is a parent and your parents and the children to have as healthy a relationship as possible. And I think, you know, that's where, for me, I often do think that's why primary is so important, because, and the work that you've done over the years, I think it's so important, because when they are at that transition stage from primary to secondary, like you said before about year 11s and, you know, and transitioning to college and all those kind of things, they're big moves in your life. Now, they're big moves regardless, but then add, again, like we say, domestic abuse to the mix, and that makes things a lot more complicated. For those children that aren't getting the support, more complicated, even more so. But if you are getting the support, it's working out for them how they, like you say, how they maneuver and go through all these challenges. But I think it is important in primary that there is some sort, and I know you've said before that it does happen in primary schools. I think it is important that conversation is had around the boundaries, around
you know, because we're always, I mean, I remember at primary school, it's like, well, you forgive and you forget and we're all best buddies again and that kind of thing. And you think, but is that teaching children that we just forgive somebody that's basically called us a stupid idiot or fat and ugly or whatever? You know, it's this is my personal opinions, and I think we need to shift away from that and say, actually, the onus is on the person that's saying that, but the person that's receiving that kind of abuse, if you like, should be able to say, actually, that's not acceptable to me. And that's one of the biggest words I've ever used with my own children on anything, any conversation I've had. If something is negative, it's unacceptable. And I think that for me is where the book starts. It's like, it's unacceptable behavior. There's no coming back from that. Don't it's unacceptable. But it is a very difficult line to tread, isn't it? And in terms of, like you say, you know, I'm just thinking then about children who are sort of that year 6, year 7 age. There's a real sort of disparity between their emotional intelligence as well. Some children are more emotionally intelligent than others. And that's not to say that's, you know, not saying that it's terrible if you don't have an emotional intelligence, but it does help, doesn't it, to have some level of understanding your emotions, whether they're good or bad, whether you've just had the biggest tantrum on the planet and gone, okay, right, I've just realised that, you know, we do it as adults. You know, we're not immune to having tantrums, but I do think that, you know, it must be difficult, isn't it, if you're working with children that haven't worked with their emotions before and don't know how to open up.
Yeah, and I think in terms of domestic abuse and sort of that field and that awareness was, as a sort of country and as a government, we're very slowly, but we're moving forward.
Yes,
Obviously, we've had the DA Act come out, and that kind of put its spotlight on children being seen as victims. Whereas, I do feel that prior to that, it was a caveat, you know, like they were a bit overlooked, or if they were displaying unhealthy behaviours or whatever at school, it was tackled as a separate issue. They weren't interlinked. And then obviously we've got the relationship element of the national curriculum coming in, and that being taught from, you know, primary school straight through to secondary. But I think it's learning as a society as we grow, because like you say, some children from certain societies, maybe more working class, low socioeconomic background, they're going to have more of an emotional like compass, shall we say. They're going to understand more. You tend to find that, you know, parents will talk more about like what's affecting them, so bills, council, you know, things like that.
They're more aware, aren't they?
Yes. Whereas then if you look at people in more affluent areas, it's not a conversation, because perhaps it's not an issue.
Absolutely.
So you've got to work, and I think it does need to be tailored. My only sort of it makes me kind of cringe a little bit is that teachers are expected to add that on to what they've already teach. And it's nothing, I'm not saying, you know, that teachers don't have that knowledge. 100% they do. They're humans, they've probably experienced it themselves. But I do feel, like I say, with all the other complexities that I've just mentioned, there comes an element of specialism that needs to come into that.
Absolutely.
And us knowing, you know, what is key for that age group, not being dictated by the government and somebody who's not in that school, and knowing the areas as well, and knowing the schools. And that was one of the things that I loved about working with C.I.C is you've got to know those areas, and you've got to know your schools. And some schools, yes, you would have more great relationships with than others, but you could go in and you could tailor that content, and you could say, right, with these year 6, we can name domestic abuse, and they're going to understand.
And they're going to get it.
Or with these, actually, in this school, let's go and call it unhealthy relationships, you know, whatever. And I was a big advocate for the film Inside Out when that came out, because I felt it's just perfect in summing up emotions and how they interact, and how obviously we all have different ones that control us. And you know, that I weave that in my therapeutic work as much as I can. And it helps children to understand, you know, that okay, dad might have a stressful day at work, so when he comes home and he perhaps needs 10 minutes to calm down in a healthy way, you know, that's because anger is in charge, and joy needs to take over. You know, and I think it's so good for children to understand, and like we say, for that younger element, break it down to that, break it down to colours, break it down to characters, because they get it.
Yeah.
And then when they do get older,
they can relate to that. Yeah.
You can throw in your more, should we say, complex words. One of the activities that I used to do with teenagers you'd get the referral from schools and it'd be like, they're angry, they're, disruptive in class, they're, excluded left, right, centre. And you go in and you speak to them and they go, well, I'm just angry all the time. But then when you broke it down, there's all these other feelings behind it.
Yeah.
Shame, there's guilt, there's embarrassment that, within an incident that might have happened. That set them off. And you can, and because they can identify that core or the presenting feeling, you can then look at what's going behind it. And then help them to understand, all right, okay, so I'm reacting defensively in the case of anger because I'm feeling shame. And it's a process that's got to be done. And that's what I mean, like when I say that the relationship and well-being element, the citizenship and well-being element of education, it's so key, but it's got to be done right for it to stick and stay and keep evolving. Because also,
by the way, I think that needs to be put into a speech.
I'm excited with me.
This is just brilliant. Again, you're just thinking about everything you've just said with children, because their mood does change, and because sometimes it could be, and this is something that probably again people don't necessarily think about, is it doesn't always necessarily mean that somebody has been in one abusive relationship. And again, there's absolutely no shame in that, because if you haven't kind of had the help or support and one abusive relationship ends and you end up in another abusive relationship, because you haven't worked through the issues from the original relationship, you may end up in this perpetual, as I call it, like history repeating itself cycle of you will pick somebody else, or you will end up with somebody else that's in, that is abusive. And then again, for children, it gets even more complex then, because it's not just the parent, it's now maybe the step parent as well. And it just, it is, I don't know what the answer to it is, but I think you're 100% right. I think unless it's done in an appropriate way with children, then it's not going to have the effect that it needs to have. And that's why specialists are the people to be going in and having those conversations with children, because they're much more prepared, maybe, for what a child will come out and say, and like you say, that may not fall on teachers necessarily. It needs to be a conversation that's had with, you can, like you say, you could see in a child that they're angry, or they're very quiet and they're very withdrawn. And I know there's a lot of schools that do this sort of the not speech therapist, the play therapist, isn't there? They have play therapists in who will pick up on elements of that. But again, that's not a specialism in domestic abuse and those kind of concerns. So it is something that I think, somebody a while ago said to me, well, what's the answer then for the next generation? Because basically, I think what they're trying to say is our generation's screwed. We're all screwed. We can all go and get the help we need, but we're going to have to work on it. But what do we do about the future generations? And I think it is, you're 100% right. It is that getting it right with children, so that they do understand, regardless of whether they potentially could be a victim or a perpetrator, that they see that behaviour is just not acceptable. Under any circumstances, you can love the parent, but that behaviour isn't acceptable. And I think anything that brings emotions like love into a situation, because the thing is, when people will say between, say, the victim and the abuser in terms of adults, well, it wasn't real love because that person was actually just trying to control you, and it was power and control, and it was love bombing, and it was, you were trauma bonded to them, all those big key phrases. But for a child, all they know is love. They're so innocent, they just want to love. And I think in some ways, and I'm probably going to get people going, I don't agree with that, I think it's harder for children, as adults who've experienced domestic abuse. Yes, you don't take it away from anybody, horrific, and you have to work through that to be able to ever move forward. But for children, all they have done, they're such an innocent bystander in it all, that all they've ever wanted to do was love and be loved. And that, for me, is what makes it so important. And I think that's why the work with children and young people has to be right. It has to be, because otherwise it's not going to work, is it? And we're going to end up with generations who, what's the difference? But you're right, with the Domestic Abuse Act, now a child is seen as a victim, no longer just a witness. And again, we have this, we've had for a long time, there's been this kind of broad spectrum of, well, can a child's perspective really, and what they think has happened, can that really be trusted? but you kind of, it's a sweeping generalization, because like we just said before, some children are a lot more emotionally intelligent than others. Some children in a class can be a year older than other children and have moved on emotionally already. So I don't think you can ever say a child isn't able to, you know, see things for what they are. I think we actually do children a disservice and an injustice when we say things like that, because I think kids are a lot more savvy than we ever give them credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. You know? That's just thinking they do make me feel old. But you know, it's when you're teaching around healthy relationships, again, that is something that needs to grow. And you know, what I started delivering in schools, you know, about 5 years ago, has changed again.
Yes,
and needs updating.
Evolved. Yeah,
you can't just keep saying this is bad, this is abusive, don't accept this in a relationship, because it's not going to work, it's going to change. You know, what was considered unhealthy when I was a teenager is still obviously considered unhealthy, but it's displayed in completely different ways now. You've got social media. There was none of that when, you know, I was young. You know, it was, I'd logged on the MSN, but then if somebody annoyed me, I could close the computer and walk away. Whereas now it's on your phone, you plug them on one thing, they can message you on another. And we're so connected, and in a way that's beautiful, it's fantastic.
If it's done right.
But if it's done right, and if it's not manipulated. And sometimes, you know, with children and, or should I say young people, when they start getting in their first relationships, they get a blank slate. You know, yes, they've seen relationships between, you know, family members on telly, etc., but their relationship's blank. And they've got to learn themselves. They've got to learn to walk again. It's
a whole new ball game.
And if you've got somebody who, you know, has been exposed to domestic abuse, so has unhealthy concept ideas of a relationship, and that bleeds in, then that other person is going to think, well, this must be a relationship. And I love them, and you know, and then they'll kind of see it in a black and white way. Is I love this person. It's not the same love that I feel from my parents. It's different. I want to be with this person, so I will do everything to make sure that I keep them. And like you say, if the relationship ends up unhealthy or it ends quite badly, you know, you always have dramatic breakups when you're a young person. And then you go into another relationship that starts off with either the love bombing, but it's happy. That is, you know, you might end a relationship sad, but then you quick to go into another one because it's happy, and that's what you're running for. You're running for happiness. Like you said, all we want is for it to be happy. And then that's what I mean. The cycle stops, and it's only really until maybe you spend some time on your own and you really realize yourself that, you know, what you want and what you want to make happy. But a lot of the time, children don't do that. They don't want to do life on their own. They do, you know, they want to do it with the peers. They want to do it with someone close, someone who gets them, someone who understands them. And like I say, when we live in a world that's so connected, they want to enhance that connection. So what was new for us, like I say, with MSN, or, you know, going to the park or something with your partner, for them it's being on the phone and FaceTime till 4 in the morning,
Snapchat,
falling asleep.
Not that I even really understand what Snapchat is. I still don't understand it, but anyway.
But the dynamics change because they want to keep that fire almost, that connection going. And it does become intense, and it is intense when you're younger. And that's when you've got to get in there and understand that young person and educate them on a level that they understand, and in a way that they understand. You know, if they are predominantly online gaming and things like that, how are they? What signs are they going to see? What behaviours are they going to see? So how can we get them to be aware? So again, it's got to change. You know, it's got to keep evolving when you live there.
And then that makes you think, what's it going to be like in another 10 years when Snapchat's now, or Instagram, whatever, is like, you know, yesterday's news, and then there's going to be something else. And it's that ever evolving. I did podcast recently with a lady called Charlotte Hooper, and she's from the Cyber Helpline, and we were talking about stalking and harassment, you know, elements of how years ago it was very much an in-person kind of crime, if you like. Now it's all over the internet.
You've got that cyber element now.
You've got a cyber element now. And we were talking about things like apps that children have, and we just touched on it, but it started a conversation around, you know, domestic abuse, and how then do the perpetrators then access the children, you know, controlling the mobile phones, controlling the passwords that the children have on the mobile phones, so they can keep that controlling the, you know, I'm just thinking of instances in the past where if somebody has said, well, they went through my roadblocks and contacted me that way, and you kind of like, what,
Yeah.
and then you have to try and give that advice to that person, say, well, it is difficult because it's their child, and how do you want the children to have the freedom to play them, you don't want them being, the other thing is you don't want them left behind because all the friends are playing online and all those kind of things. But for a parent, it's very hard, especially if we're going now into the realms of, say, if there's a non-molestation order or these things like that, that parent is finding subtler ways of contacting the child when maybe they shouldn't be having contact with the child, and for a parent that's trying to monitor all of that, it just takes it to another level. It is exhausting, and I think we don't give a lot of the time parents enough credit for being parents anyway, number one, but for parents who are trying to navigate I would like to say choppy waters, but I think it's worse than that, of domestic abuse. I can't even think of the tidal wave, the absolute sheer hell that is domestic abuse. It is, you take your hat off, don't you? Because it's such a difficult, impossible situation to try and deal with, but with the right support, with finding the right support. And one thing I do find I do get asked quite a bit is, well, I do know such and such a video, and I know this, and where would you signpost them to? I think that's another thing, probably for another podcast, is the signposting. I was talking to some people at CrimeCon last weekend, and they were professionals that work within the NHS, and they were saying that, we're not quite sure in terms of the signposting, because I don't think it's necessarily training that's done across the board in terms of DA training. So where do you signpost people to? And all you can really, from my point of view, say it would be your local domestic abuse charity, it would be the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, those. And I've had recently about employers, this is how big it is, well, what do I do about? And I think that's in terms of signposting parents and getting back to parents, I think it's important that they know that there is support in their area. It doesn't matter where you are, there will be some support around. And even if you're then referred on to somewhere else, at least you know that there is support, and there is no shame in it. That's the biggie, isn't it? There's absolutely no shame in it whatsoever.
And that support isn't as big and as scary as social care and police, because that's, instantly what you kind of drawn to when you think domestic abuse is, oh, well, police must be involved. And social
they're going to take my children away.
And again, I'm going back to, like I say, when you're building that relationship with the parent, and you're having those conversations, they might not want their child to have the stigmatism of mental health and access a counselling service. Most children, when you go and see them in school, you do have some that are quite anxious around, well, I'm going to be pulled out of class. What do you mean? What do I tell class? Because what do I say? So you've got that kind of stigmatism that you're fighting as well on both sides, with parents and children. But it's definitely about getting in there and making sure that, like you say, if what you do in person, if going into school isn't it isn't possible for that child, because it's going to make that situation worse. We are so lucky now to have services online. You've got Coop is a fantastic one for children, and it's taught mostly in schools now, and the awareness is there. And then for parents, they can not monitor in a an overprotective way, but they can know what their children are doing and saying. And you've got support services out there for parents as well, in terms of them just offloading with other parents, support groups, and just learning together. And eventually, it might take a couple of months, or it might take a couple of weeks. But then, people come around and they might say, yes, I'm happy for you to come to school, or I'm happy for you to come out to house, whatever. But I think the issue that you've got, like you say, with things like the NHS and, with schools, is that rigid element that is put into it. They, some schools can't offer the space for you to go in and do a therapeutic intervention. They've not had the appropriate training. It's a quick online e-course or something like that. So in terms of further afield, not local charities, not local small services or what have you, there is a disservice there that is just the way that it is at the moment. But that's why I'm saying we're 2 steps forward, but then we're still 2 steps back.
And absolutely. And I think it will, over time, it will get there, but it is going to be a process, and it is going to take time. And I think the biggest thing I would want anyone to take away from our conversation is, you know, there definitely is no shame in getting help, and doing nothing isn't going to change anything.
No.
You know, nothing will change if nothing changes. That's the same my husband always says, and I used to think it was really weird, and as I've got older, I'm like, actually I totally agree with that, because nothing changes if nothing changes. And you know, like you say, no one is judging, and I think that's the one word that constantly comes up around domestic abuse is judgment. You know, what will people think of me? What will people think if I'm getting help from my children? And what you, like you say, you know, taking out the classroom, or there is no judgment from support services. All they want to do is help you to live the best life you possibly can. And we all know when domestic abuse has been at the heart of any situation, it is realistic to say it's very difficult in terms of trying to move forward, but you can do it. It is possible. You know, you can live a happy life, you can have healthy relationships, you can see where, you know, if you see, you can spot it in a relationship and go, actually, yeah, that's not for me. No, you're going to have to, you know, no, sorry, you're going to have to, off you go.
Not acceptable.
Not acceptable, off you go. And you do have, you know, you empowered, I suppose, is the word then. And it is, we need more of that. And especially, you know, we've been through a pandemic, children being at home a lot more in domestically abusive situations and relationships where it probably has seemed like it's even more normal because they're not having that escape, if you like, to school, or parents aren't having that escape to work. And you know, we're coming, I think what we need to appreciate as society is that this is going to take time, because there are going to be a lot of children who, you know, we talk about curriculums and how, you know, obviously GCSEs, things like that, where there were adjustments in marking and things because of the pandemic. But, you know, when we talk about domestic abuse, there's a lot there that children are still probably unpacking themselves, thinking, I'm actually just now trying to get myself back into being in school. I'm trying to get myself back into a routine. And then to add domestic abuse to that on top of everything is difficult. But I think it is always, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. There is always help, there is always support, and there is no shame and there is no judgment. And I think people like you seriously need awards and medals and every accolade known to man. I'll put your name forward. Oh, but I think we've got to do another one. Because I'm just absolutely be here all day. But no, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's been absolutely wonderful, and we will be doing it again.
Yes.
Thank you.
Where